We are going to go ahead and get started. Lots to dive into and talk about today, but firstly, welcome everyone to the webinar, and thank you all so much for joining us today and taking the time to be here. My name is Kayla Ripple, and I'm a principal associate with the Lenfest Ocean Program. And if you aren't as familiar with us, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program. We fund ocean and coastal research projects to address needs that are facing decision makers and stakeholders. And you can learn more about us and the projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. While you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter to receive updates, much like ones for the project that you'll learn about today. Today is the 8th webinar in a series that highlights projects from our Climate Resilient Fisheries grant portfolio, where we're supporting projects where scientists are working with managers and stakeholders to better understand how to navigate the challenges that climate change poses to fisheries. So these projects are tackling different pieces of the puzzle, ranging from predicting distribution shifts of important fish stocks, understanding the climate vulnerability of communities that depend on those fish stocks, and providing recommendations for adaptive management of fisheries, among many other topics. If you're interested in learning more about those projects, my colleague Emily Knight will be dropping a link in the chat box. And here you can also view and sign up for upcoming webinars that we have in the series. We have webinars scheduled every month through January 2025 right now. So lots to learn about. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, December 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific on Can Flexible Fishing Permits Lessen Climate Stress on California Fisheries? And Emily's dropping a link for that in the chat as well. But for today's webinar, we're excited to have joining us several members of the research team, including Ariel Levine with San Diego State University, Chris Dumas with North Carolina State University, Wilmington, Juliano Palacios Abrantes with the University of British Columbia, Katie Longo with the Marine Stewardship Council, Jackie Vogel with San Diego State University, and Scott Crossan with NOAA Fisheries. They'll be sharing more about their project to understand how to inform adaptive allocation options for fish stocks across management boundaries. And we're dropping their project page in there as well in the chat if you want to read more about that. I'm going to let the research team get into the details, but this is a really tough issue that affects many people in different regions. The team has worked with fishery management councils, industry representatives, and so many more to inform what models and outputs could be most useful for informing adaptive allocation options. And we're excited for them to be here today and to share some of their initial findings with us right now. Before we get started, just a few logistical things. To prevent any feedback or echoes, all attendees are muted, but we really would love to hear from you. So please drop your comments or other resources that you think would be useful to share with others in the chat box during the webinar. And if you have questions for the speakers, please submit those in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping track of these through the webinar, and we'll read the questions aloud at the end for the research team to answer. If we don't get to your question, or if you have follow-up questions, please do reach out to us at Lenfest or members of the research team after the webinar. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll distribute the link broadly afterwards to share so that you can share with others. And again, follow up with us should you have any other questions. And with that, I think I've covered everything. So I'm going to turn it over to Ariel to share her screen now. And I think to also get us started.
Share here. All right, can you see it? Okay, fantastic.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much, Kayla, for that introduction. We'll be presenting today on a multifaceted project with a large team contributing, who are all pictured here. Oops, I already advanced it. Exploring the potential for adaptive allocation for transboundary fish stocks. And a few of us will take turns presenting the different aspects of our project today. To start out with the framing of this problem, climate change is shifting where fish stocks are located worldwide, and this is resulting in management challenges in regions where allocation agreements are based on historical distributions of fish species that may not reflect current distribution patterns under changing ocean conditions. For instance, black sea bass allowable catch was until very recently allocated to states based on the distribution of catches between 1980 and 2001. And in the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a pretty significant shift or range expansion north to waters off of Rhode Island, New York, and Massachusetts. And this resulted in a dislocation of fish from allocations. And these shifts in where fish are located could create problems. For instance, catches could decrease in the trailing part of their range or in shallower waters, meaning that fishermen in these areas would need to burn more fuel to chase the fish. Or on the other hand, catches could increase in the leading part of the range or in deeper waters. And this could result in fishermen having to discard fish if allocations to fishermen in this area were too small relative to fish availability. And fishery councils in the U.S. have recognized the need to reconsider how some stocks are allocated based on these new distribution patterns. However, policies and processes for reallocating stocks are lengthy and complex. There's a considerable time lag between identifying where shifts are happening, determining if these shifts are temporary or will continue, consulting with a wide variety of stakeholders about the implication of these shifts and possible reallocations, proposing allocation changes, and implementing these changes. And in any reallocation discussion, there's also important issues of fairness and equity, and underlying these discussions is also the need to prevent overfishing. There are also important questions that emerge regarding how state boundaries should be considered for species that are harvested in federal waters, as well as how to weight historic catch versus current species distribution in determining these allocations. So our group has been exploring one potential mechanism to address many of the challenges that emerge in reallocating quota, which we refer to as dynamic or adaptive allocation. As stocks shift, the allocated quota would change to reflect their distribution using a predefined rule for how quota allocation would be determined. However, there's a lot of challenges to implementing such a system. One is the fear of the unknown and perhaps a hesitance to adopt a new allocation system, particularly if it is complex and future allocations are uncertain. There are also technical barriers in terms of determining the right way of calculating distribution, particularly since species shift seasonally and there aren't really clear predefined jurisdictional boundaries at sea. And there may also be a lack of incentive to change if people are benefiting from historic allocations. So our group wanted to explore how adaptive allocation might be implemented, as well as explore potential economic and livelihood implications for different scenarios in the way quota was determined under adaptive allocation. We also explored paths and barriers for potentially integrating this type of approach and climate science more broadly into fisheries management. So our approach and what we'll be presenting today was to first do a retrospective analysis. Giuliano Palacios Abrantes led the first part, and I'm not sure if he's actually on, but if he is, he'll be presenting on how he explored changes in distribution over time for 3 species on the US East Coast, including black sea bass, summer flounder, and scup. Chris Dumas will then present the outcomes of an economic model that explored the economic outcomes of different allocation scenarios if adaptive allocation based on species biomass distribution had taken place in the past. Next, Jackie Vogel will present the outcomes of a collaborative workshop that explored methods to effectively communicate and incorporate the science on new species distributions into fishery management. And finally, Katie Longo will discuss the broader applicability of an adaptive allocation approach in other species, as well as what factors enable or inhibit adaptive allocation. And with that, do you know if Giuliano was able to join? I don't see him.
He's not in the panelist list, so
Okay.
I would allow Chris to go ahead.
Okay. Chris Dumas has generously agreed if Giuliano was not able to show up to present Giuliano's portion. So I'll hand it over to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Ariel. Let's see, Kayla, could you activate my video? My not able to activate my video here.
Yep, 1 second. Okay.
Great, there we go. Hi, folks. So first, I'd like to discuss one of the initial questions our group investigated, and this was work done by Giuliano Palacio Abrantes, who's now at the University of British Columbia. And Giuliano looked at three fish stocks that appeared to be shifting along the Atlantic coast of the United States. He looked at black sea bass, summer flounder, and scup. All three of these species are both commercially and recreationally important. And so he looked at NOAA trawl survey, research trawl survey data to over 40 years to see whether there was evidence that there were shifts in the geographic distribution of these stocks, and he found that was indeed the case. He looked at both the location of the three species offshore over time and also fall versus winter. He found that there were significant uh, changes in the distribution of summer flounder in the fall, and scup in the spring, and black sea bass in the spring. And he found also changes for summer flounder in the spring and black sea bass in the fall, but those changes were not statistically significant. But there are changes, so there's evidence that these species are moving. So the problem is the current allocation of quota across states is based on the historical landings of these species from generally in the 1980s. And that was before the the large portion of the stock shift occurred. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, Ariel? Great. So if we're looking at dynamic allocation, we've got two problems. The fish are moving both along the coast, north to south, and also inshore and offshore seasonally in some cases. And although the fish are allocated across the states within state waters, which are in 3 miles of shore, their fish are not allocated to the states geographically in federal waters, which are from 3 miles out to the US EEZ. So the question arises, how should we allocate quota dynamically in the federal waters offshore across the states as the fish move? Next slide, please. So Giuliano considered two different possible approaches to allocating quota as the fish move. The first approach is called the state geographic boundaries approach. That's the top row of figures in this slide. And in that approach, we take each state's geographic coastline and buffer it out, extend it out into the ocean, and assign quota to the states based on proximity to their geographic coastline. In areas where the buffers overlap between adjacent states, then the quota in that area would be allocated equally across the states. And the second quota allocation approach in the bottom row of figures on this slide look at allocating quota based on historical but recent landings at different fishing ports in the states. So in this approach, we take the fishing ports that have the top 25% of landings for each species and take those ports and buffer out from those fishing ports with the highest landings, and then assign the fishing quota based on fish landings. So the different, and what we find in the last column of figures in this slide is that the approach does matter. If you reassign the dynamic quota based on the state geographic proximity to the state geographic boundaries, you would have one distribution of quota across the states. But if you assign the quota based on the ports that had the greatest fish landings, then you'd get a different allocation of quota across the state. So the way that you would assign quota across states as the fish move affects the results that you get. Next slide. Right, so this shows the difference between the two approaches, the state geographic boundaries approach versus the landings at fishing ports approach, and shows the proportion of the total coastwide quota that would be assigned to each state over the two approaches. And you see that the difference in colors shows that there is a difference across the two approaches. For example, with the landings at fishing ports approach, New York would get assigned a larger proportion of the catch than if we use the state geographic boundaries approach. And the figure to the right on this slide just shows the difference between the two approaches. And in this case, we're looking at summer flounder in this example, the two approaches are most different for New York, and they're less different for North Carolina and Maine. Next slide. So here's a look over time at how the two different approaches to assigning quota dynamically would affect the distribution of quota across the states over time. So on the left panel, we see landings at fishing, how the quota will be assigned across states based on historical landings at fishing ports, and to the right, we'd see how quota would be assigned across states based on proximity to state geographic boundaries. So there's certainly a difference. And so this just points out that if you're thinking about dynamic allocation, the method that we use to assign quota to different states can make a difference. And that's something that should be considered by fishery managers as they look at dynamic allocation. Okay, next slide. All right, now we're going to move on to this, the next phase of our project, and this is looking at a fishery simulation model that was developed by myself. And this was a computer simulation model implemented in the R computer software, and this was based on a series of web meetings we had with industry and agency stakeholders about the fisheries and about both the commercial and recreational fisheries. So we built a computer simulation model that was retrospective analysis. So it was looking at the fishery from 1990 to 2019, over 30 years. And we were asking the question, what would have happened in these fisheries if we had looked at different management methods, different management regimes to allocate quota? So we considered all the states from Maine to North Carolina, and we looked at 3 species, summer flounder, black sea bass, and scup. But today I'm just going to focus on summer flounder to meet our time constraints. And we looked at both commercial fisheries and recreational fisheries. For the commercial fisheries, we looked at we have an individual vessel based model, so we're following individual vessels. For the recreational fisheries, we're looking just at a statewide approach to manage state by state approach to modeling the recreational fisheries. Today, I'm going to focus on the commercial fishery results. And for both the commercial and recreational fisheries, we evaluate economic impacts, differences in landings, and economic impacts for different potential quota allocation policies. Next slide. So focusing on the commercial fishery, we looked at, this is a vessel by vessel simulation model. So we were modeling each vessel. We focused on commercial otter trawl vessels pictured here because they represent most of the catch in this fishery. And we looked at otter trawl vessels that were 30 feet or longer in length that had summer flounder permits. In this example, in the year 2019, there were 656 vessels in this limited entry fishery. And we said, what if those 656 vessels had been in the fishery in 1990, and we let those same vessels go forward through time and fish in the fishery under different management scenarios, different management policies, because we wanted to hold the fleet characteristics constant over time as we looked at what happens when the fish change their geographic distribution under different management scenarios. So we're holding the fleet and vessel characteristics constant. One of the interesting findings early on was that vessel length is an important determinant of the fishing characteristics of these vessels. Vessel length determines vessel speed, fuel use, crew size, and the fishing power of each vessel. So vessel length plays an important role. It's something that fishing managers should look at, and is to some extent a sufficient statistic for all of the fishing characteristics of these trawl vessels. Trip duration plays an important role in the model. How many days can each vessel stay out at sea? We assume that vessels less than 60 feet in length typically make single-day trips, whereas vessels greater than 60 feet in length can make multi-day trips up to 4 days in length. Typically, trip length is constrained to around 4 or 5 days due to product freshness concerns. The captains want to make sure that they get the catch back to the port to sell with maximum freshness to make sure they get the maximum price. So those were the freshness constraint was a major concern in limiting trip duration. For each vessel, we estimated an equation that estimates the fish landings and per fishing hour. That was a function of vessel length and also a function of the fish abundance per hectare out in the ocean. And so as the fish distribution shifts, the fish abundance per hectare changes in the different ocean grid cells, and that would affect fishing landings if a vessel chose to fish in that grid cell. In our model, vessels do not switch their home ports, and vessels landed their catch in their home port for 87% of the vessels in our that we followed. So that we thought that was a good assumption. Crew were paid 50% of the catch share after trip costs. Each trip, the vessel chose the ocean grid site that maximized its trip returns, maximized its profit from that trip. Vessels made decisions daily. So this is a daily model. So for 30 years, 365 days a year, each vessel individually was deciding which ocean grid cell to go fish in to maximize its profits. And then we determined landings based on those fishing trips, and then economic impacts on shore, both on supply side and distribution side from those landings using a supply-driven input-output model. Next slide. So in our commercial fishery model, we take into account weather. Weather varies randomly daily. Weather is different for each state based on the historical weather patterns in each state. Weather days can be good or bad weather days. A bad weather day has precipitation greater than ½ an inch a day. That correlates pretty highly with wave height and wind speed, which are determinants of bad weather for fishing trips. We also consider natural mortality of the fish, natural mortality subtracted daily within the model. We can also consider discards, the discard rate and mortality, discard mortality rate for the fish, and discard mortality subtracted from fish abundance in each ocean cell daily. Bycatch is included. Bycatch in the sense of other fish species that can be landed and sold in addition to the target species. Fish prices are also included in the model. The fish prices vary by year and by state and by species. Based on the historical fish price variations. There's also an option to have the size of landings affect fish prices within the model. Diesel fuel prices vary by region and year, and all prices were adjusted to 2019 year equivalent prices. Next slide. So these are the management scenarios we considered. First was sort of our baseline historical scenario, which used the baseline quotas that were based on the fishery landings back in the 1980s. So assuming those baseline quotas stay in place over the whole simulation time period, 1990 to 2019, what would have been the landings and the economic impacts? Of course, as the fish distribution shifts, those vessels fishing in trailing areas have longer travel distances that increase fuel costs and take fewer trips. Fewer trips are worth it. Those vessels in the leading areas where the fish are moving into, if they don't get additional quota, then if their landings are limited by the quotas, so that results in additional discards in those leading areas. In addition to that historical management scenario, we look at 4 other scenarios, what we call a fully dynamic scenario, in which the fish are assigned, which quota is assigned to the various states based on the biomass shift, based on proximity of the fish to different fishing ports. We use the fishing ports approach in our simulation model. We also look at what we call a 50-50 scenario, where the fishing quotas are based on 50% of the historical landing quotas from the 1980s, and 50% are based on the current location of the fish. A gradual shift approach, where 100% of the quota was based on the 1980s distribution of the fish landings in the first year of the simulation, but over the 30 years of the simulation, we shift and include increasing amounts of the quota is based on increasingly on the current location of the fish, so that by the end of the simulation period, 100% of the quota allocation is based on the current location of the fish abundance offshore. And then finally, in the stepwise or static trigger approach, the historical quotas are used to allocate fish up to a trigger coast-wide quota allocation amount. Any catch beyond that level is then distributed based on the current locations of the fish, distributed dynamically. Okay, next slide. So we're still working on these simulations. Typically, they take a long time. We're using a supercomputer at North Carolina State University to speed up our simulations and get some confidence intervals to be able to do some probability analysis. But in the end, we'll have results that sort of look at like this format. So we'll have the different management scenarios as the columns. We'll have the different states as the rows, and we'll be able to show for each state the differences in landings and the different economic impacts for each state depending on the management scenario. So that's still work in progress. Hope to report on that soon. Next slide. So now I want to talk about some emergent themes that came out that we're able to determine so far based on our simulation modeling. First is that vessel length matters. Results of dynamic allocation can be different for smaller vessels versus larger vessels. Vessel length affects the vessel speed, the range of the vessel, and their trip duration, and that affects which ocean grid cells are profitable for the various vessels to fish. This also affects the vessel's ability to chase the fish as the fish distribution shifts. Shifting stops, therefore, have different implications for large and small vessels. Another important takeaway from simulation so far is that weather is important. Bad weather results in a fishing vessel staying in port, so a fishing trip is delayed. Late arrivers to fishing in a given ocean grid cell would earn lower profits from fishing in that cell because that ocean grid site has already been fished out by fishing vessels are able to arrive earlier. So therefore, a vessel may choose just to not even take that fishing trip because it's not worth it, given that they were delayed by the weather. So weather is important, and we see in our model the weather varies randomly, and on different model runs, different weather occurs in different fishing ports, and we can definitely see the weather affecting the distribution of landings across the states. So it may be the case that the model is, if weather is bad in a particular area, they may give an extra quota, but they may not be able to use it because the weather is bad and prevents them from taking trips. So weather is important. Another important emergent theme was the importance of substitute target species. We found that the model fits best when we included the option of substitute target species. For example, for otter trawlers in the Northeast US, Northeast groundfish fishery is an important substitute target species. So we added that to our model. The profitability of these substitute fishing trips has an important impact on the target species, such as summer flounder trips, modeled by our simulation model. So it can be the case that, yeah, for example, if we give more summer flounder quota to fishermen in the Northeast, if the Northeast groundfish fishery is very profitable for them, then they may not use the additional summer flounder quota, even if we give it to them, because the groundfish fishery is more profitable. So substitute target species can affect the results of dynamic allocation. Next slide. Another emergent theme is that other types of regulations mediate the effects of dynamic allocation. For example, trip limits, which are limits on the landings allowed per fishing trip, are an important factor in these fisheries. Trip limits often vary by state. Trip limits on the target species, if the fishery's current fishing at the trip limit, then that can reduce the benefits of increased land quota allocation due to dynamic allocation, because if a trip limit regulation can prevent you from using the additional quota that you're allocated. It can also reduce the cost of decreased landing allocations. If your current quota allocation is higher than your trip limit, then if that allocation is reduced, that doesn't affect you because you could not use that allocation anyway because you were currently fishing at the lower trip limit. So trip limits do affect the results of dynamic allocation. The final emergent theme here is that shifting stocks have disproportionate nonlinear effects at the edges, the geographic edges of the fish stock distribution range. So an example of this is provided in the graphic on the lower right. So in this graphic, we look at stock abundance changing along the bottom axis of the graph from smaller abundance on the left-hand set of bars to larger abundance on the right-hand set of bars. If you're a vessel fishing at the limit of the outer limit of fish stock distribution, then your trip costs are going to be high relative to your trip revenues, as shown in the left two bars. So your profit will be relatively small. Say in this example, $10 of profit. If the fish abundance doubles in your area, fish move into your fishing area, a doubling of abundance could potentially double your revenues, but the effect on your profit is your profit increases by 11 times. So a doubling of abundance leads to 11 times increase in your profit at the leading edge of the fish stock distribution chain. So that could have a large effect on fishing behavior and fishing trips. Similarly, if you're in an area where fish are moving out of your area, then your fish abundance in your area may decrease by half if we move from the right set of bars to the left set of bars. But that 1/2 reduction in fish abundance leads to your profit being reduced by 90%. So changes in trip revenues and profit are much larger than the changes in fish abundance. And so relatively small changes in fish abundance at the leading and trailing edges could have a much larger impact on fishing behavior and profits than managers might at first think. Next slide. So some of the takeaways for fishery management outcomes of dynamic allocation vary with the vessel size and also with the timing of the quota change. If dynamic allocation is adopted earlier in the geographic shift of the stock, then all vessels at the tail end of the shift are affected because they still have fish that they're catching, even though they're at the tail end of the stock. But mostly it's the larger vessels at the leading edge of the fish change that will be affected, because only the larger vessels are the ones that are able to access the stock as the stock is just beginning to move into their area. On the other hand, if dynamic allocation is adopted late in the stock shift, then this affects mostly the larger vessels at the tail end of the shifting stock, because these are the only vessels that were able to access the fish stock that's moving away from them. And all vessels, both large and small, would be affected at the leading end of the stock shift, because at the leading end, enough fish would have moved into that area that both large and small vessels in the leading end can affect them. Another takeaway is that future climate change may increase or decrease the important effects of weather in mediating the outcome of dynamic allocation. So if climate change increases the amount of bad weather in an area, this can reduce the benefits of dynamic allocation that are occurring in the leading or head end of the stock shift, but can also reduce the costs at the tail end of the stock shift, because the bad weather was already limiting their catch. So if you take some quota away from them that they were not using because of the bad weather, then that has less of an impact on them, because the bad weather was already causing the effect. And finally, model results are sensitive to the fine details in the fishery dynamics, sort of as I think you've come to see in this little discussion. We gained a much better understanding of the fishery dynamics and how dynamic allocation can play out over time in a fishery by developing this model. It's important to allocate sufficient time to modeling efforts such as these before you implement dynamic allocation, in order to make sure you identify the most important factors that could affect the impacts of your dynamic allocation management strategy. Thank you. And now I'd like to hand it over to Jackie Vogel, who will look at the results of her team's work on translating some of this science into policy action. Jackie?
Thanks, Chris. So what Juliana wasn't here, but Juliana's work and what Chris just presented, all of this kind of provides the groundwork for this next phase of the project, which dives deeper into this connection between science and action. And in particular, looking at these pathways through which all the incredible important science that you just heard about, thinking about the pathways through which that's getting implemented in the spheres where it's most important. So it's clear that we have oh, you can go back to the last one, actually. Yeah. So it's clear we have a ton of information on fishery distribution shifts and dynamics. So in an ideal world, you think that, all this information that we have and the economic models that Chris just presented, all of that would be immediately involved in management. Managers would read our papers, understand what we're trying to say, and everyone would have a perfect management system. But obviously, that is not how the world works. And this connection between science and policy is a pretty difficult one to understand, and especially to infiltrate if you're not super ingrained within the system. And add to that this growing importance of timely integration of science, given climate stressors and the transboundary shifts that you've heard about so far. So given all that, our research team decided that this was a topic that's really worth exploring. And we did that through a workshop. Next slide. So in this workshop, we brought together scientists and managers and these other in-between people like those at NGOs or Lenfest or other organizations. And our goal was really to talk through this science to policy landscape and what the process looks like for the specific case of managing for changing fishery distributions under climate change. So we had representatives from all over the country, which is what this map is showing here. And this little pie chart at the top is showing the spread between managers and scientists that were represented. So we definitely had an overrepresentation of researchers as compared to managers, mostly due to the fact that we organizers were researchers, so that was who we were most able to reach. But we did have enough of a spread to have the types of conversations we were interested in having in this policy science interface. And there were a lot of really interesting outcomes of this workshop, but our main goal was to get everyone on the same page about how these connections between science and policy are currently working, and to figure out where the bottlenecks are that can have some actionable solutions going forward. Next slide. So one of the main outputs that we published earlier this year, and I think Kayla just put a link to it in the chat, is this set of pathways and specific recommendations for scientists, funders, policymakers, and anyone else in between. And these actions are really just our way of distilling the ideas and experiences of 31 people from very different parts of fishery management into a tangible list of things that we could all agree on. So I won't go into too much detail about this since this is already a jam-packed webinar, but I just want to highlight what these results actually look like so you can go take a look at the paper if you're interested. So on this slide, we're showing a schematic of our second pathway, so 2 pathways overall, the second one. And this one emphasizes the need for collaborative prioritization of goals for climate resilient management. Basically just meaning that we need everyone to agree on what our end goals are in the first place before we dedicate a bunch of time and money and research priorities to things that might not be within everyone's best interest in the long run. So on the research side, that might look like aligning publication timelines for scientific papers with management windows and doing that to ensure that the information can actually have an impact and be read in the spaces where it's most relevant. And on the management side, that could look like creating more formal processes for considering long-term models like Chris presented and past disturbances in decision making. So these are the general themes that we discussed as our group, and then there are specific actions nested within each of these categories. Next slide. So I'm just showing one of them here. We have 26 actions in general that we recommend in the paper, but this one's particularly relevant to this webinar, and it recommends improving models and evaluating the effects of different allocation methods. So obviously the work of this group that you've heard so far is very relevant for this action, and also the fact that people were talking about this was relevant to Chris was also presenting at that workshop. So results are a little skewed, but I think it does point to the fact that there's wider interest in this type of work for other fisheries around the US. And the fact that all the 31 people involved in this workshop agreed that these types of studies are really important going forward and can have a really big role in informing management that can address these types of allocation concerns going forward. So with that very brief overview, I'll turn it over to our last speaker, Katie, who'll talk about some of the other impacts of this work.
Thanks, Jackie. So if we can go into the next slide, I'll jump right into this expanding our thinking beyond the 3 case study fisheries that Chris presented and thinking about how do we know whether it's worth it to consider adaptive allocation in other fisheries. And I'm going to start by thanking Nikki Roberts that helped develop this rapid assessment tool that we wanted to develop to answer this question in different fisheries in the US. So the tool is based on lessons learned from this project and also literature on adaptive management and conflict resolution. So it presents a framework, and the idea of the framework is that it helps to quickly identify what are the enabling factors or the bottlenecks towards adopting adaptive allocation in a particular fishery. And the idea is that it can help councils prioritize whether a particular fishery is a good candidate and could be looked at more in depth, for example, with a model such as Chris's to understand then what the impacts might be of adaptive allocation. And it is applicable to any fishery that we know has their distribution is shifting across state boundaries. So if we go to the next slide. So this is showing what are the actual attributes that we are including in this allocation tool framework. So first of all, we're interested in the governance flexibility attributes. On the left-hand side, you see institutional cooperation, so characteristics that help the jurisdictions that are all sharing the stock in question collaborate. For example, are they sharing the scientific information? Are there joint management bodies? Are there agreements? And then on the other hand, as Jackie's just mentioned, one really important point is the link between management and science, and in particular, and how that gets translated into scientific advice. So with these attributes, we're looking at whether there's already the mechanisms in place to have the scientific information that's needed to develop a dynamic allocation system, and then whether there are the management approaches in place to actually put it in practice. So some examples here are whether there are previous events where the stock allocation was adjusted based on distribution, and what's the level of research management integration. And then next, the other important thing to consider are then the trade-offs for the fishing industry. So their ability then to adapt to the shifts in the fish, and also to adapt to changes in the quota allocations. So understand what is their mobility, what is their ability to access capital, for example, to enter new fisheries. Next. So what we did is then we tested this tool with experts in some case study fisheries to see whether it actually works. So we did these online roundtables with experts in 3 fisheries: summer flounder, Spanish mackerel, and Pacific sardine. So for each of these, we engaged experts that could represent those 3 domains: so policy, scientific advice, socioeconomic dimensions of the industry. And we brought them together online. They looked at a shared spreadsheet where we had all these attributes and indicators that then they could score together to ideally reach a consensus. So what you see below on this slide is this scoring system. So here I'm showing as examples just a few of the attributes that I mentioned. So institutional cooperation attributes. For each of those attributes at the center, you see that we have multiple indicators that were identified by this research team plus a few additional experts. So in this example, interjurisdictional agreements, we're looking at whether they were present, whether they covered joint allocation, whether they covered conflict resolution approaches. And for each of them, we had a rubric, so guidance, to then assign whether each of those was absent, partially present, or fully present. Next. I'm going to show you results for a couple of the fisheries. And I want to thank Melissa Aaron that helped facilitate and develop these online workshops. And I'm showing you results in particular for summer flounder. You'll recall that's one of the 3 fisheries that Chris presented a model for. And then on the other hand, a very different fishery, Spanish mackerel. And I'm going to show you then where we identified in green the bottlenecks, and then in orange, in green the enabling factors, and in orange potential bottlenecks for those 3 dimensions. So that institutional, management, and advisory and economic dimensions. So for summer flounder, this is a fishery where there's already a history where they readjusted quota, acknowledging there had been a spatial shift in the stock. And in terms of enabling factors, there's already in place cooperation between the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council and the Atlantic Management Commission. So they're already collaborating across states to deal with quotas. From a management and advisory perspective, there is a consultation process that involves all relevant stakeholders from the different sectors and across the states. There's an example of already having reviewed the quota in the past in 2020. And also there are models in place that can be used to inform a potentially an adaptive rule. However, in terms of bottlenecks, currently there is no previous event where dynamic rules were used. And in particular, from the economic point of view, we saw that there was a limitation in the adaptability, in particular for the inshore component of the fleet. So what you might remember from Chris's model is he was dividing the vessels based on those that were larger or smaller than 60 feet. So these are the vessels that are smaller. They are less mobile. They're less able to go after the fish if they move. And they're also less able to switch to other target species. And there are no compensation measures in place. Next, we can look at Spanish mackerel. So this is a very different fishery because there are no quotas. It's an open fishery. And from a commercial point of view, it's not a particularly important target because it's more an opportunistic target. It is important from a recreational point of view, but commercially it is caught as and when it is possible as an additional fish. So from an institutional point of view, there is cooperation between the Southern Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico councils. However, it's worth mentioning that if the stocks were to shift further north, other councils would need to become involved, and currently there isn't cooperation in place. Same thing for stakeholder consultation that is currently present for these stakeholders in these councils, but not farther north. And from an advisory perspective, there currently is no models in place that would be able to advise on spatially based quotas. And because this is a fishery where there are no permits in place, and it is not a high value fishery, it is difficult to switch to other target fisheries. A lot of the other fisheries in the area have higher value permits that would have to be purchased. If we go next. So the lessons learned from this is that industry adaptation emerged as a key bottleneck across all 3 examples. I only showed 2, but this was true also of our 3rd example. And from a tool perspective, the experts in these workshops valued the ability to bring together these three dimensions, the policy side, science advice, and socioeconomic, and to synthesize them in one simple approach. And that the tool might be most useful to provide these desk-based summaries that can provide background research for council staff or technical advisory groups that might want to consider, is it worth it going down a path of adaptive allocation for this particular fishery? Do we want to go down the route of developing a model such as the one that Chris presented? And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ariel.
I was having some video issues there. Thanks, Katie. So adaptive allocation is a potentially powerful tool to consider in fishery management in adapting to climate-induced species shifts. But as we've seen, it's also complex. And our project worked to address many critical questions that may arise in considering adaptive allocation, including how do scientists determine fishery range shifts over time? How should managers determine allocation when jurisdictional boundaries are unclear? What drives fishing behavior when stock distribution changes? What are economic outcomes of different allocation scenarios across jurisdictions? How can science on adaptive allocation be incorporated into fishery management processes and decision-making? And what factors enable or inhibit the success of using an adaptive allocation approach? And we realize that this is an ongoing and important topic of conversation taking place between scientists, policymakers, and stakeholders engaged in fishery management. And we hope that our project helps to provide useful insight to better inform that conversation moving forward. I want to express thanks to everyone who's contributed to this project. I'm going to give a little extra thanks to Chris, our economist, who is pretending to be a marine biologist today and presenting Giuliano's portion of the project. And if anyone would like to learn more about the project results, we have two publications out, which are referenced here, one based on Giuliano's portion of this presentation and one based on what Jackie presented today, as well as two additional publications in process, one on Chris's economic model and outcomes, and one on the allocation tool that Katie presented. And with that, thank you very much. We'll take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ariel, you don't have to keep sharing your screen, but you're welcome to keep this up for a few more minutes if you want to make sure people have the chance to get all this information. I also dropped the links to both of the published papers in the chat, so everyone should have access to that, and we'll definitely be following up with the ongoing publications and once those are published. We did have a couple of questions that came in, so I'm just going to start with the ones that I saw in the chat. There's two of them that I'm sort of going to try to combine because they really get at the collaborative aspect and process of the project. So firstly, this person is really just curious to know what your backgrounds are, how you all met each other and got to work on this project together, but also how and whether industry was involved at all in the design of the research model, or just trying to better understand some of those scenarios, Chris, that you were laying out in your research model as well. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. Firstly, how does your interdisciplinary team work together? How did you meet? And then secondly, how are you gathering information to inform the research design and the model itself?
Well, just getting back to how we met, actually, maybe you, Kayla, or Sarah or Emily could talk a little bit more about the workshop that brought some of us together to try to do, try to facilitate interdisciplinary work on shifting fish stocks.
This was one of the projects that came from an ideas lab that Lenfest Ocean Program hosted in, I think, 2018 or so, 2019, which was actually before I was here. But that was a workshop that was basically meant to bring together people across the sector working on fisheries management issues to identify what those main research questions were and what those barriers were that needed to be addressed in order to move forward on trying to figure out what it means to build climate resilient fisheries. This was one of the projects that came from that, and because that workshop was inherently very cross-sectoral, it was easy to get lots of different people who hadn't met each other before sort of working together, but also talking about like different things that could potentially be barriers in the future and then come up with solutions for that. So I think most of you were there. I know a few of you have also joined throughout that process, and I see Sarah jumped on as well. So Sarah, feel free to talk more about that. But yeah, I would love to hear, you know, the working with everyone and how that's worked.
Yeah, I won't take much time because I know we have a lot of other questions. I will put a link in the chat for the LenFest page about the Ideas Lab, which was really focused specifically on the issue of shifting fish stocks, and bringing people together across sectors. So if people are interested in that, I will put that link in the chat.
Yeah, but anyway, so that's where we met. I hadn't met a lot of the people on that I'm now collaborating with today until that workshop. But I was there. Olaf Judson, who was not able to be on the call today, but who's a fisheries biologist. I'm a fisheries social scientist. Katie Longo, who's you heard from today, was there, and Scott Crossan, who didn't speak today, but who's an economist. And we were able to bring in, Giuliano worked as a postdoc under Olaf. Scott knew Chris and said he would be perfect for doing this kind of work. Jackie works with me as a PhD student now, so we brought her in. So, we had a lot of opportunities for discussion at that Ideas Lab that helped us formulate, ideas for what a collaborative research proposal would look like. And that kind of brought us all together and having the same discussions and realizing that this was a really important question that we needed to approach from multiple angles to really understand how to the different factors that are involved in considering adaptive allocation. And then I think the second was about involving industry and stakeholders, which we did. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, at the beginning of the project, we had a number of Zoom sessions with both agency and industry representatives to sort of get their expertise and their advice and their insight as we developed our project and developed our model. I dropped the names and affiliations of some of those folks who we met with one or more times in the webinar chat. So agency folks, well, first of all, Scott Crossan and I, we were on the SSC for the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. So that's some agency representation. Also, Olaf is involved with the Mid-Atlantic, I think, Council. But we also met with Jason McNamee from Rhode Island DEM, Julia Beatty from Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, Fishery Management Specialist, Robert Rule from the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. So there were some agency and council folks that we met with. I've also personally emailed with several other agency folks with data requests and things like this and getting their input and advice as the project has gone forward. As far as industry people, we met with several of those. We met with Katie Almeida and Mike Roderick of Town Dock Seafood in Rhode Island, a big player there in commercial fisheries in Rhode Island. We met with Megan Lapp of Seafreeze, which is one of the largest fish processors here on the East Coast of the US. Also, we spoke with Greg DiDomenico of Lund's Fisheries out of Cape May, New Jersey. All of them were very generous with their time and provided guidance, and especially developing the commercial fisheries model and sort of identifying what were some of the most important factors that affected the ability of vessels to take fishing trips and factors affect where the vessels might go to fish, and important factors on vessel profitability and so on. So we appreciate that guidance. We did try to reach out and get those agency and industry insights from developing our project.
That's great. And speaking of the model, this question again goes back to you, Chris. Are there multi-species trip limits in the fishery, or are there only species-specific trip limits in the model? This person is wondering if managing with one versus the other would change the benefits or costs of dynamic allocations, and specifically thinking about how different species in a complex may have different degrees of range shifts or climate responses.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Currently, we only have species-specific trip limits in the model. trip limits for the particular target species that we're modeling. We have 3 separate models, one for summer flounder, one for black sea bass, one for scup, commercial models, and then we have separate recreational models for those 3 species. And so currently we have species-specific trip limits. I think looking at how do multi-species trip limits affect the model results would be a very interesting thing to do. We could do that with our model, but that's something we've not looked at in the sort of initial round of simulations. Another question about the model, I'll just answer that real quickly, was how do we account for fisher mobility? So we had that was a big question at the beginning of developing our model. Should we allow the fishing vessels or the fishermen to change ports as the fish stocks shifted, and to change the ports they operate out of, and to enhance their profitability? We decided not to allow vessels to shift ports in this current version of the model. That's a feature that we could add to the model, but we decided for these first runs to keep the vessels sort of tied to their home ports. And again, we're modeling the 2019 fishing fleet, and we're saying suppose the 2019 fishing fleet was the fleet that was in place from 1990 to 2019, so that we can hold the fishing fleet constant as we look at the effects of changing fish stock distribution and changes in what management strategy we're using. And so if we also had the vessel shifting, that's an additional factor shifting that would obscure the effects of the changes in management scenarios and changes in the shifting fish stock. However, we could alter the model to allow the vessels to change ports based on which port would be the most profitable to operate out of. That's definitely a straightforward thing that additional loop we could add to the model, but we've not done that as of now.
A lot of considerations. Jackie, did you include the council staff or SSC members in the workshop?
It wasn't the same list of council staff and SSC members, but we did have council representation, and a few of them are co-authors on the paper. And the others who weren't, their names aren't public because they didn't agree to that, but we did have the numbers that are in that pie chart represent council staff.
Very great. All right, we got through all the questions, so unless there's any closing thoughts that you all would like to share, I just really wanted to thank you all for being here today, both to our attendees, but also to our speakers who shared all of this really great research. We will be following up with a recording of this webinar, so please feel free to share that. And then we'll also share links to the papers, as well as in the future, new papers when they come out with this distribution list. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.